Welcome back to the Deep Dive. You ready to jump into some Civil War history with me today?
Absolutely. Always fascinated by this period. So much to unpack.
No kidding. We're really going deep on leadership, battlefield decisions, the choices that shaped the war, and of course the human impact. Can't forget that.
Right. It's not just about battles and dates. It's about the people who lived through it, the choices they made.
Well, we've got some incredible personalities to discuss. Grant, Lee, but also some lesser-known figures who really made a difference.
Yeah, what I find so interesting is how these narratives we're looking at today reveal the strategic thinking on both sides, the challenges those commanders faced, and the experiences of the soldiers on the ground.
We're talking pivotal campaigns, too. Red River, Appomattox, all these decisions made under pressure and the ripple effects.
Exactly. Decisions with lasting consequences. Take the Red River campaign, for instance. Shows how politics, economics, and military objectives, they all get tangled up.
Nathaniel Banks, right? I was reading about him. Big focus on cotton.
Yeah, he saw it as a way to fund the war effort, but it didn't quite pan out the way he hoped.
So that focus on cotton, did it end up hurting the Union in other ways?
Oh, absolutely. Diverted resources from other important campaigns, even impacted Sherman's Atlanta campaign.
Wow, it's like a chain reaction.
Yeah.
What seems like a small decision can have huge implications.
Exactly. And it wasn't just about cotton. The Red River campaign also highlights the tension between political appointees like Banks and seasoned military officers.
Well, Banks did face some pushback from guys like A.J. Smith, right? Who, if I remember correctly, saw the whole thing as a distraction.
Right, he did. And the troops, some of them weren't too impressed with Banks either. They started calling him Napoleon P. Banks, kind of sarcastically.
That doesn't sound like a vote of confidence. Okay, so let's talk Grant. Taking on the Eastern Command, massive responsibility. I know Foote's book mentions Grant was initially hesitant to leave the West.
Yeah, he was. Seemed more comfortable with the less formal atmosphere out there. He even brought his chief of staff, John Rawlins, with him from Nashville to Washington.
Interesting. So there was a real cultural difference between fighting in the West versus the East.
Definitely. West was seen as more pragmatic, less concerned with protocol and hierarchy. The East, much more politically charged.
Must have been a tough adjustment for Grant.
It was. And there was definitely skepticism from some Eastern officers. They doubted Grant could handle Lee.
Lee's reputation definitely preceded him. There's that quote, I think, where one officer said, Grant will shortly come to grief if he attempts to repeat the tactics in Virginia, which proved so successful in Mississippi.
Wow. Talk about a lack of faith. Seems like Lee's shadow loomed large.
He was seen as this master strategist, constantly outmaneuvering Union commanders in Virginia. Grant, some saw him as a brute force fighter.
Hadn't really been tested, at least not against someone like Lee.
Right.
But Lincoln, he had faith in Grant, didn't he? Gave him a lot of autonomy, which other commanders hadn't really gotten. He did. It was crucial, actually, Lincoln's trust in Grant. Allowed Grant to really wage that relentless campaign against Lee's army.
It's like Lincoln said, Grant is the first general I have had. I am glad to find a man who can go ahead without me.
Exactly. He'd learned from past commanders, guys who hesitated without presidential approval. Grant was different.
Interesting. So now let's look at Lee's side. What were some of the challenges he was facing?
Well, Lee relied heavily on Jeb Stuart for intel, for knowing what the enemy was doing. And Stuart being absent during the Wilderness Campaign really hurt him.
Stuart was basically his eyes and ears on the battlefield, right?
Yeah.
So without him.
He had to rely on less reliable sources, which put him at a disadvantage, especially with Grant on the offensive, constantly applying pressure.
Lee was on the defensive, forced to adapt constantly. I think Foote mentions Lee's frustration with some of his own guys, too.
Yes. Felt like they missed opportunities for counterattacks.
Tough spot to be in. Morale must have been difficult to maintain under that kind of pressure.
Absolutely. And it was taking a toll, veteran units depleted, resources dwindling.
Yeah, the strain was showing.
Yeah.
Plus, Foote talks about Lee's personal grief over losing Stuart.
Yeah.
It wasn't just a strategic loss, it was a friend.
Exactly. Lee deeply admired Stuart, his skills, his loyalty. It was a blow on a personal level added to the weight he was already carrying.
It's a reminder that these weren't just figures on a battlefield. They were people dealing with complex emotions, relationships.
They were. And, it wasn't just about those battles on the front lines. The Confederacy was facing its own internal struggles too, right?
Right. It wasn't a completely unified front.
No, not at all. Lots of disagreements about strategy, policies, even the fundamental goals of the war. Jefferson Davis had his hands full, let me tell you.
So while Lee's battling Grant, Davis is fighting his own battles back home.
Exactly. And Lincoln had his own political tightrope to walk, keeping his party together, maintaining support for the war, which was getting more and more costly.
It's hard to even imagine that kind of pressure, you know, making those decisions while trying to hold the nation together.
Wartime leadership, it's not just about military tactics. It's about understanding people, navigating the political landscape.
Speaking of understanding people, one thing I really appreciate about Foote's book is how he brings in the experiences of everyday soldiers. It's not just the big picture stuff.
That's what makes his work so compelling. He weaves those personal stories into the grand narrative, reminds us that history is made by ordinary people too.
You really get a sense of their struggles, their fears, their hopes, the camaraderie that helped them endure those hardships.
And he doesn't shy away from the brutality of it all either. Those hand-to-hand fights, the cries of the wounded, the terror of facing an enemy determined to kill you.
It's sobering. Really forces you to confront the dark side of human nature.
But even in that darkness, he finds those glimmers of courage, compassion, soldiers risking their lives to save their comrades, acts of kindness across enemy lines.
Amazing. Moments of humanity amidst all that chaos.
They remind us that even in war, there's still that capacity for good. Okay, so shifting gears a bit. Foote talks a lot about Grant's overall strategy, his relentless pursuit of Lee, the heavy casualties.
He was willing to sustain heavy losses, believing that the Union's resources would eventually win out. Bold strategy.
It was, and some criticized him for it, the cost of human life. But Foote also highlights Grant's belief that a longer war would be even more devastating in the end.
The lesser of two evils, I guess.
Yeah.
But still, an impossible choice for any leader.
Absolutely. Grant understood that war is brutal, tragic. He had a pragmatic view, you might even say unsentimental.
And you see that in how he responded to setbacks. He never seemed to lose his determination.
Resilience was key. Adapting plans, pushing forward, always looking for a weakness to exploit, never giving up the initiative.
Like his decision to cross the James River. Caught Lee by surprise.
A real turning point. Shifted the focus, put more pressure on Lee's dwindling resources.
Foote doesn't just focus on Virginia, though, right? He talks about other campaigns, other leaders.
He does. John Morgan's raid into Kentucky, for example, ended in defeat and his death, but it showed the range of the conflict, the different tactics being used.
Jubal Early's campaign in the Shenandoah Valley, too. He actually posed a threat to Washington for a while.
He did. These smaller campaigns, they might not be as famous, but they add another layer to our understanding of the war.
Right. It wasn't just one big clash. It was happening on multiple fronts, with all sorts of strategies and personalities at play.
Exactly. And then there's the naval side of things, like the duel between the Alabama and the Kearsarge.
Yeah. Two evenly matched ships going head to head.
High stakes. The Union blockade of Confederate ports was crucial, really hampered their ability to trade, get supplies.
Right. The war wasn't just on land. The seas played a huge role, too. But through it all, Foote never lets us forget the human cost.
He brings those individual stories to the forefront. Soldiers dying, families torn apart, the psychological scars that remained long after the fighting ended.
You can't just look at the casualty numbers. Yeah. You have to remember those were real people.
And as the war dragged on, both sides were feeling the strain. Resources dwindling, casualties mounting, a growing weariness.
Foote even talks about the death of Jefferson Davis's son, a personal tragedy for him, but it also symbolizes the widespread suffering across the South.
Absolutely. Davis, the president, but also a father grieving his child, really humanizes him.
Foote also highlights the massive social and economic upheaval the war caused. The South's economy was in shambles, while the North was industrializing rapidly.
It was a turning point for the whole country. Politically, socially, economically, we're still dealing with the repercussions today.
The legacies of slavery, civil rights, it all goes back to this period.
It does. As the war entered its final year, you could sense the desperation on both sides. The Confederacy was running out of options. The Union was nearing victory, but at a tremendous cost.
Foote captures that tension, that uncertainty. Even though we know the outcome, he makes you feel like it's still hanging in the balance.
He's a master storyteller. He takes you beyond the dates and battles and immerses you in the experience, the emotions, the human drama of it all.
It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just facts and figures. It's about real people, their lives, their choices, their sacrifices.
Exactly. And to understand the complexities of leadership during this period, we need to look at specific examples, like the Red River Campaign.
Right, a campaign that ultimately failed, but one that reveals a lot about the challenges Union leaders faced.
It was a complex operation, lots of moving parts, and it really tested Banks' abilities as a leader.
You mentioned before that Banks was a political appointee, not a seasoned military officer. How did that play into the campaign's problems?
Well, Foote points out that Banks struggled to manage such a diverse force and coordinate a campaign of that scale.
Lack of experience showing, I guess. But it wasn't just him, right? There were other issues as well.
The Red River itself was a huge obstacle. Unpredictable currents, shifting sandbars. Remember that incident with the ironclad Eastport?
Yeah, ran aground, had to be abandoned. Sounds like a logistical nightmare.
It was. And there were also those internal conflicts. Banks butting heads with his subordinates, especially A.J. Smith.
Classic case of clashing personalities, undermining the whole effort. So what happened on the battlefield itself?
Confederate forces under Richard Taylor, they inflicted heavy losses on Banks's army. Sabine Crossroads and Pleasant Hill, those were tough battles.
Forced Banks to retreat, the whole Shreveport objective abandoned.
Exactly. A defeat for the Union. And not just a localized defeat. It affected things elsewhere.
Because it pulled resources away from Sherman.
Right. Slowed down his progress in Georgia, which shows how interconnected everything was.
Like dominoes. What happens in one place can ripple out and affect the whole war.
Precisely. But, there were also successful Union campaigns like Sherman's drive towards Atlanta. That one stands out as a real strategic masterpiece.
Cutting his supply lines, living off the land, marching deep into enemy territory. So it was a gamble, wasn't it?
It was. But Sherman was willing to take that risk. He knew Atlanta was crucial, a major industrial hub, transportation center. Capturing it would cripple the Confederacy.
And it did, right? Huge victory for the Union, morale booster.
It cemented Sherman's reputation, too. A truly innovative and effective commander.
Grant and Sherman, both willing to make tough calls, sustained heavy losses. But different approaches, different personalities.
Grant was more about wearing the enemy down, relentless pressure. Sherman, a bit more visionary, bolder, maybe even a touch reckless.
Both effective in their own ways. But let's go back to Virginia for a minute, where Grant's still on Lee's trail. The Overland Campaign, that was brutal.
Oh, it was. Grueling battles, heavy losses on both sides, the wilderness, Spotsylvania, Cold Harbor. Foote really captures the savagery of those fights.
Wilderness, that was a dense forest, right?
Mm-hmm.
Made it difficult to maneuver.
Exactly. Chaotic, close quarters fighting. And Spotsylvania, that featured the Bloody Angle, one of the most intensely fought engagements of the war. Trenches, hand-to-hand combat, just horrific.
Awful. You read those descriptions and you can't help but picture the suffering of those soldiers.
And those battles took a toll on Grant, too, mentally, seeing so many of his men die or be wounded.
It reinforced his determination to end the war, even if it meant more losses. He felt it was the only way to stop the bleeding, so to speak.
Grim, but probably true. A prolonged war would have just meant more suffering. But were there any, moments of grace amidst all that horror?
That's what I was wondering. Did the soldiers ever, show any humanity towards each other?
There were instances, yes. After Spotsylvania, for example, there are accounts of soldiers from both sides helping to retrieve the dead and wounded.
It's like in the midst of all that hatred and violence, there's still a flicker of recognition, a shared humanity.
It's a powerful thing to witness. And as the campaign continued, the strain on Lee's army became more and more evident. Veteran units decimated, resources running low, morale plummeting.
The North's industrial might was really starting to show, wasn't it? They could just outproduce the Confederacy.
Yeah, the Union had the advantage in terms of weapons, ammunition, supplies. The Confederacy was struggling to keep up.
And it's not just about bravery, it's about logistics. You can't fight a war without the resources to back it up.
Right. The Civil War really highlighted that shift in warfare. Industrial production, logistical networks, those became essential.
Foote mentions another interesting point about Lee, his grief over Jeb Stuart's death. It wasn't just a military loss, it was deeply personal.
Yeah, it speaks volumes about Lee's character. These were real relationships, real bonds. The loss of a friend on top of everything else must have been devastating.
It humanizes him, doesn't it? It's easy to forget that these generals, these leaders, they were still human beings with emotions, with vulnerabilities.
And Foote does a great job of reminding us of that. History is not just about battles and strategies, it's about the people who lived it.
It's amazing how Foote can make you feel like you're right there alongside those people, experiencing it all firsthand.
He's a master at weaving those personal stories into the broader historical narrative. You meet the famous generals, but also the everyday soldiers' families caught in the crossfire.
It's not just names and dates, it's real people, real lives impacted by the war. And Foote doesn't shy away from the brutal side of it either.
No, he doesn't sugarcoat it. He describes those horrific scenes, the sheer brutality of combat, the bloody angle at Spotsylvania, the destruction Sherman's troops left behind in Meridian, Mississippi.
It's a reminder that those battles weren't just strategic maneuvers. They were incredibly costly in terms of human life.
And it wasn't just physical wounds either. Foote talks about the exhaustion, disease, hunger, the mental and emotional toll the war took on everyone.
Even those in charge, like Jefferson Davis
Right.
losing his young son.
Hmm.
It just shows that no one was immune to the tragedy of it all.
Right. War touches every aspect of life, leaves scars that can last generations. But even in the midst of all that suffering, Foote finds those moments of hope.
The acts of courage, compassion, those glimmers of humanity that shine through the darkness.
Stories of soldiers risking their lives for each other, kindness shown across enemy lines. It's a reminder that even in the worst of times, we're still capable of good.
It's powerful.
Mm.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Civil War leadership and strategy, what stands out to you as the biggest takeaway?
I think it's the realization that leadership in wartime, it requires more than just military skill. It demands a deep understanding of the human condition.
Right, these leaders were making decisions that had life or death consequences for thousands of people. An incredible burden.
It was. And for everyone listening, I encourage you to keep exploring this period of history. We've only scratched the surface here. There's so much more to uncover, so many stories to be told.
Absolutely. The political landscape, the social changes, the long road to reconciliation. The Civil War was a turning point in American history, and its legacies are still felt today. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We'll see you next time.